It started like any other day. I never expected that morning to become the worst of my life, leading me down a dark path of betrayal that I wouldn't have imagined, even in my most twisted nightmares. My stepmom and I didn't always have the best relationship, but things had been getting better recently, or so I thought. Little did I know, behind her seemingly kind smile lurked secrets that would unravel everything I thought I knew about trust, family, and loyalty. My dad married Angela a few years after my mom passed away. At first, I resented her, seeing her as an intruder in our lives. She wasn't my mom and could never replace her. Over time, though, Angela made an effort to build a connection with me. She took me to soccer games, came to my school events, and even helped me with homework. Slowly, I began to let my guard down, and we developed a cordial, if not close, relationship. Things weren't perfect, but they were stable. That is, until everything fell apart. I'm not sure exactly when I started noticing strange things about Angela. Maybe it was subtle at first, a lingering glance, the way she laughed a little too hard at my dad's jokes, or how she was constantly checking her phone and leaving the room. But one day I stumbled across something that turned my suspicions into concrete proof. It was a Sunday afternoon, and my dad had gone on a business trip. Angela was upstairs taking a nap, and I was bored out of my mind. I decided to play a few games on my dad's computer, something I did all the time. I wasn't snooping, just casually browsing when a notification popped up. It was an email titled "Can't wait to see you again" from a man named Robert. I hesitated for a moment, feeling that pang of guilt you get when you know you're about to invade someone's privacy. But the curiosity, or maybe the suspicion, gnawed at me. I clicked on it, and the email opened up, revealing a conversation far too intimate to be between colleagues or friends. There were pictures attached, ones I definitely shouldn't have seen, with Angela and Robert together, kissing in what looked like a hotel room. My stomach lurched. The emails went back months. Angela had been cheating on my dad all along. Suddenly, everything clicked: the secret phone calls, the unexplained absences, and her increasingly distant attitude toward my dad. I couldn't believe it. Angela, the woman who had stepped into my life, pretended to care for my dad and me, was sneaking around behind his back. I felt a knot of betrayal tighten in my chest. I needed to confront her, but I wasn't sure how. The truth was, I wasn't even sure if I should tell my dad. Part of me wanted to expose her immediately, but another part feared the consequences. What would happen to our family? I couldn't focus on anything else for the rest of the day. I stayed in my room, brooding over what I had discovered. Every time I heard her footsteps coming down the hall, my heart raced, and I felt a mix of anger, disgust, and confusion. Should I confront her now? Should I wait? I didn't know what to do. By the time night fell, I was emotionally exhausted. I laid down in my bed, my mind still racing with thoughts of Angela's betrayal. Eventually, sleep claimed me, pulling me into a restless slumber. When I woke up, something was wrong. My wrists were bound tightly to the bedpost, and my legs were tied together. I struggled to move, but the ropes were too tight, cutting into my skin every time I tried to pull free. Panic surged through me as I looked around the room. It wasn't a dream. I was tied up, and I had no idea how it had happened. I tried to scream, but something was stuffed in my mouth, a cloth, gagging me. My heart pounded as I frantically looked around. It was then that I saw her. Angela. She was sitting in the corner of the room, her expression unreadable. The Angela I thought I knew was gone. In her place was someone cold, calculating, and terrifying. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way," she said, her voice eerily calm. "I didn't want it to come to this, but you left me no choice." I couldn't speak. My mind was spinning. What was she talking about? Why was I tied up? How did she even know I found out about her affair? Had she somehow seen me going through the emails? My mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. "I know what you're thinking," she continued. "You're wondering why this is happening. You're thinking about those emails, aren't you?" She gave a bitter laugh. "I saw you snooping. You should have stayed out of it. But now that you know the truth, I can't let you ruin everything." I struggled against the ropes, but it was no use. Angela stood up and walked over to me, her expression hardening. "I love your dad," she said, as if that somehow justified what she was doing. "But I can't have you messing things up. You have no idea how complicated this situation is." Tears welled up in my eyes as I realized just how trapped I was. My own stepmom had tied me up, and I had no idea what she was planning to do next. Would she hurt me? Would she try to silence me permanently? "You're going to stay here until I figure out what to do with you," Angela said, her voice cold and detached. "Don't even think about trying to escape. No one's going to hear you." She turned to leave the room, but just before she walked out, she paused and looked back at me. "I hope you understand," she said quietly. "This isn't personal. It's just necessary." The door closed behind her with a quiet click, leaving me alone in the room, still tied up and terrified. My mind raced with possibilities. Would she really keep me here forever? What if my dad came back and saw me like this? What would he think? Would he even believe me? Time passed slowly as I lay there, bound and helpless. Every sound outside the door made my heart race. I had to find a way out, but I didn't know how. The ropes were too tight, and I was too weak to break free. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to subscribe to the Betrayal Tales channel and comment your thoughts below. We have more shocking stories on the way, and your support keeps us going. Eventually, I heard the sound of footsteps approaching the door. My heart pounded in my chest as Angela opened the door, her expression cold and distant. She walked over to the bed, her eyes locking with mine. "You're going to keep quiet about everything you've seen," she said, her voice low and threatening. "If you try to tell anyone, I'll make sure you regret it." I didn't know what to say. I felt trapped, powerless, and betrayed in a way I never thought possible. Angela had taken everything from me: the sense of security I once had, the family I thought I could trust, and now my freedom. But I wasn't going to give up. Deep down, I knew I had to find a way out of this. I couldn't let Angela control me. I couldn't let her get away with everything she'd done. Days passed, and I remained tied up in that room, waiting for my chance to escape. Angela continued to come and go, acting as if nothing was wrong. My dad was still away on his business trip, oblivious to the nightmare unfolding at home. Then, one evening, something changed. I heard the sound of my dad's car pulling into the driveway. Angela's face went pale as she heard it too. She turned to me, her eyes wide with panic. "You stay here," she hissed, rushing out of the room and slamming the door behind her. I heard the muffled sound of voices downstairs, Angela trying to act normal, my dad unaware of the situation unfolding upstairs. My heart raced as I realized this could be my chance. If I could just make enough noise, maybe my dad would hear me. With all the strength I had left, I thrashed against the ropes, kicking and pulling as hard as I could. The ropes dug into my skin, but I didn't care. I had to get free. I had to let my dad know what was happening. After what felt like an eternity, I managed to loosen the ropes just enough to slip one of my hands free. My wrist was raw and bleeding, but I didn't care. I quickly untied the rest of the ropes and stumbled out of the bed, my legs shaky and weak. I rushed to the door, flinging it open and running down the stairs. My dad was standing in the living room, talking to Angela. When he saw me, his eyes widened in shock. "What the hell?" he exclaimed, rushing over to me. She tied me up," I cried, pointing at Angela. "She's been cheating on you, Dad. I found the emails." Angela's face twisted in anger and panic as my dad turned to her, his expression one of disbelief and fury. "Is this true?" he demanded. For a moment, Angela looked like she might try to deny it, but then something shifted in her eyes. She straightened up, her expression turning cold and defiant. "Yes," she said, her voice icy, "but you wouldn't understand. You never do." My dad's face crumpled in pain and betrayal as Angela turned and walked out the door without another word. It was over. The moment Angela walked out of the house, it felt like the air itself shifted. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. My dad stood frozen, his face pale, staring at the door as if he couldn't believe what had just happened. Neither of us moved or spoke for what seemed like an eternity. Then, slowly, He sank down onto the couch, his hands covering his face, shoulders shaking as he let out a long, shaky breath. I didn't know what to do. My dad had always been the strong one, the one who kept everything together, and now he looked utterly broken. The woman he loved, the woman he had married and brought into our lives, had betrayed him in the most brutal way possible, not just by cheating, but by terrorizing me. "Dad," I whispered, my voice hoarse and cracked from the hours I spent tied up, trying to scream through the gag. I sat down next to him, unsure of what to say, what to do. The betrayal felt like a wound that wouldn't heal, throbbing painfully with every passing second. "I'm so sorry," I finally managed, even though I wasn't sure why I was apologizing. I wasn't the one who had done anything wrong, but seeing my dad like this, completely shattered, made me feel responsible somehow. Maybe if I had confronted Angela sooner, if I had spoken up before everything spiraled out of control, things wouldn't have ended like this. He looked at me, his eyes red and raw. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know how, I admitted. "I found out just yesterday. I didn't want to ruin everything. I thought maybe I could figure it out first." He shook his head, his expression one of deep pain. "You shouldn't have had to go through this alone," he said quietly, then reached out and pulled me into a hug. It was the first real connection we'd had since my mom died. I felt his arms tighten around me as if he were trying to hold on to what little was left of our family. After a while, my dad finally spoke again. "We need to call the police." The mention of the police made my heart race. Angela might have been gone, but the danger she posed wasn't over. She had tied me up, held me hostage, and who knew what she was capable of doing next. We needed to make sure she didn't come back. "I'll make the call," my dad said, standing up slowly, his movements stiff, like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He picked up the phone and dialed, explaining to the police what had happened, trying to keep his voice steady as he spoke. I stayed silent while he talked, replaying everything in my head. Angela was gone, but the nightmare wasn't over. There was a part of me that still couldn't believe it. How could someone you trust, someone who was supposed to be part of your family, turn out to be capable of such cruelty? It felt like something out of a dark Reddit thread. A story so twisted you'd only expect to read it online, not live through it. When the police arrived, everything felt surreal. They asked me questions about what had happened, how Angela had tied me up, what I knew about her affair with Robert. I told them everything I could remember, but the more I spoke, the more detached I felt, like I was talking about someone else's life. The officers were kind, but their faces were serious. They took down my statement and my dad's before promising to do everything they could to find Angela. For days, I didn't leave the house. Every creak, every shadow made me jump. I couldn't shake the fear that Angela might come back. My dad was just as shaken, though he tried to hide it. We didn't talk much. There wasn't much to say. The betrayal hung over us like a dark cloud, and neither of us knew how to move past it. I found myself spending hours on the internet, reading stories of betrayal and cheating, trying to make sense of what had happened. I even found threads on Reddit about people who had gone through similar things, stories of stepmoms, fathers, spouses who had turned on their families, stories of forced confinement, psychological manipulation. It was strange, but in a way, reading about other people's experiences made me feel less alone. If you like this story, don't forget to subscribe to the Betrayal Tales channel and comment your thoughts in the comment section below. Every story helps us realize how fragile trust can be. One night, a week after Angela had left, there was a knock on the door. My dad and I exchanged a glance, both of us tense. My heart raced as my dad opened the door, revealing two police officers standing on the porch. "We found her," one of the officers said. The relief that washed over me was immediate, though it was tinged with fear. Angela had been arrested. She was in custody. But that didn't mean the damage she had done would disappear. The officer explained that Angela had been found at a motel just outside of town, and they were holding her on charges of unlawful confinement, assault, and of course adultery. My dad thanked them, his voice strained, and closed the door behind them. She's going to pay for what she did, he said, but there was no satisfaction in his voice. He wasn't happy. None of this felt like a victory. It was just sad. In the weeks that followed, my dad filed for divorce. He couldn't bear to stay married to someone who had betrayed him so completely, not just through her affair, but through the way she had terrorized me. The process was slow, painful, and filled with legal battles, but eventually it was over. Angela was out of our lives for good. It took a long time for things to return to any sense of normalcy. My dad and I tried to rebuild what we had lost, but there was always an undercurrent of distrust that lingered. I couldn't help but feel paranoid, constantly second-guessing the people around me, wondering if they too might have hidden us. My dad was more distant, more guarded than he had ever been. The scars Angela left weren't just physical, they were emotional, and they ran deep. But we survived. We made it through, even though it wasn't easy. And in the end, we learned an important lesson: trust is fragile, and once it's broken, it's almost impossible to repair. Every now and then, I still think about Angela, wonder where she is, what she's doing. Sometimes I imagine running into her, and I wonder what I would say if I did. Part of me wants to confront her, to demand answers, but another part of me knows it wouldn't make a difference. Angela made her choices, and we had to live with the consequences. Life went on. My dad and I built a new routine, a new life without her. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and that was enough. As time passed, things started to settle down. My dad threw himself into his work, probably as a way to distract himself from the pain of everything that had happened. He barely spoke about Angela anymore, and neither did I. It was like we had made an unspoken agreement to move on and not let her be a constant shadow over our lives. But the truth is, moving on was harder than I expected. Every time I walked past the room where Angela had tied me up, I felt a shiver run down my spine. I couldn't shake the memories of that day, the fear, the helplessness, the betrayal. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, convinced that I could hear her footsteps outside my door, even though I knew she was long gone. I started having nightmares, dreams where I was tied up again, only this time no one came to save me. In these dreams, Angela wasn't just my stepmom, she was some kind of monster. Her face twisted into a cruel smile as she tightened the ropes, whispering that I would never escape. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my hands shaking, and it would take hours before I could calm down enough to go back to sleep. My dad noticed the change in me, of course. He wasn't the kind of person to ask too many questions, but I could tell he was worried. Sometimes I'd catch him looking at me, a deep sadness in his eyes, like he blamed himself for everything that had happened. I wanted to tell him that it wasn't his fault, that Angela's betrayal wasn't something he could have predicted or prevented, but the words never came. We both carried the weight of her actions in our own way, silently, without ever really discussing it. Eventually, I realized I needed to talk to someone about what had happened. Keeping it all bottled up inside wasn't helping, and the nightmares were getting worse. So, one day, I decided to open up to a close friend of mine, Lisa. She had always been there for me, through thick and thin, and I knew she would understand. We met up at a small coffee shop near my school, and after some small talk, I took a deep breath and told her everything. From finding the emails to waking up tied up in my room, I laid it all out, not holding anything back. Lisa listened quietly, her eyes wide with shock, but she didn't interrupt. When I finally finished, she just sat there for a moment, processing everything. That's insane," she said softly. "I can't believe she did that to you." "Neither can I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I could trust her. You know, she was my stepmom. I didn't think she was capable of something like this." Lisa reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You're so strong for getting through this," she said. "I don't know how I would have handled it if it were me." I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. Hearing her say that made me realize just how much I had been holding in. I had been trying so hard to be strong for my dad, for myself, but the truth was, I was still hurting, still scared. I can't stop thinking about it," I said, my voice trembling. "I keep having nightmares. I'm always tied up and Angela's there, but no one comes to help me." Lisa looked at me with concern. Have you talked to anyone about this, like a therapist? I shook my head. No, I don't know if I'm ready for that. I think it could help, she said gently. You've been through something really traumatic. You shouldn't have to deal with it alone. Her words made sense, but the idea of talking to a stranger about what had happened felt daunting. Still, I knew she was right. I couldn't keep pretending like everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. After that conversation, I decided to give therapy a try. I found a counselor who specialized in trauma, and while the first few sessions were tough, it started to help. Slowly but surely, I began to confront the fear and anxiety that had been haunting me since that day. Talking about what had happened, rather than keeping it bottled up inside, helped me regain a sense of control over my life. In the meantime, my dad and I continued to rebuild our relationship. We were never the kind of family to sit down and have heart-to-heart conversations, but in small ways, we started to open up to each other. He apologized for not being there when I needed him, and I assured him that none of what happened was his fault. Angela had fooled both of us, and we couldn't let her actions destroy what was left of our family. Eventually, the divorce was finalized. My dad didn't fight it. He just wanted it to be over. Angela was out of our lives for good, and though I knew the scars she left would never fully heal, there was a sense of closure that came with her absence. But then, one day, something unexpected happened. It had been about 6 months since Angela had walked out, and life had more or less returned to normal. My dad and I were doing our best to move on, and for the first time in a long time, things felt okay. The nightmares were less frequent, and I was starting to feel like myself again. Then, I received a message on Reddit. It was from a throwaway account, no username, no profile picture, just a single line. I'm sorry. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. Could it be her? Could Angela have somehow found me after all this time? I hadn't used my real name on Reddit, and my account wasn't linked to any personal information. But still, the timing, the message, it felt too coincidental to ignore. I didn't reply. Instead, I showed the message to my dad. He looked at it, his face darkening with concern. Do you think it's her? I asked, my voice trembling. I don't know, he admitted, but his eyes told me that he had the same sinking feeling I did. We decided to take the message to the police. They couldn't confirm whether it was Angela, but they advised us to be cautious. My dad installed a security system in the house, and we became more vigilant. For weeks, I lived in a state of paranoia, jumping at every sound, every unfamiliar face I saw in public. But the message never came again. Whoever had sent it, whether it was Angela or someone else, seemed to have disappeared. Eventually, I started to relax, though the memory of that single line lingered in the back of my mind. Months passed, and slowly life returned to some semblance of normal. I focused on school, my friends, and rebuilding the life that Angela had tried to take from me. Therapy continued to help, and though the nightmares hadn't completely stopped, they became less frequent. The fear that had once gripped me so tightly began to loosen its hold. My dad, too, seemed to be healing. He started dating again, cautiously at first, but with more confidence as time went on. I was happy for him. He deserved to find someone who truly cared about him, someone who wouldn't betray him the way Angela had. As for me, I realized that while the scars of betrayal run deep, they don't have to define you. Angela had taken so much from me, my trust, my sense of security, but she hadn't taken everything. I was still standing, still fighting, and that was something no one could take away. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to the Betrayal Tales channel for more real-life stories of deception and heartbreak. And if you have your own story of betrayal, share it in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. In the end, betrayal is a painful part of life, but it doesn't have to break you. It's what you do afterward that matters. You can either let it destroy you, or you can choose to rise above it and become stronger than you ever thought possible. For me, I chose the latter, and I'm proud of that choice every day.